Welcome back to U.S. History. Today, we're learning about Chapter 8. Let's get into it. All right, so the videos are back. Shout out to Julian. And what I need you to do is watch the videos, okay? So the first part of the class, we made videos, but you guys didn't watch them very well. The second part, we were in our book and we kind of got a little more motion. This time, watch the videos, take the quiz, do your best. Let's get started. So, last time on U.S. history, the revolutionaries, the patriots, they won, they have their freedom. What is the document where England acknowledges that we are our own country? Okay, the Treaty of Paris. It's kind of bookends to the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence, we declare we are free. Treaty of Paris, England agrees and signs it, okay? So we've got our own country. Now you'll see throughout history, winning the revolution, as difficult as it is, that can sometimes be the easy part. The hard part is now what? How do you govern a country? How do you create a new country? So what are some things you would need? Let's pretend we're starting a school. What kind of departments would you need? You need a facilities department to clean up after, janitorial. You need some type of employee department to hire teachers and deal with HR. You might need a student council or student government to help the students out. You need different departments. Does that make sense? Okay, that's going to be coming up today. Okay, so Washington's going to create some different departments. The Department of Treasury, the Department of State, and the War Department. We have the DOD today, Department of Defense, because defense sounds so much better than war, right? Anyway, they just called it the War Department back then. We have a debt. Remember, we fought this war and wars aren't free. And then we're going to have the Whiskey Rebellion, which is really interesting and important to know. So let's get going. Today's objectives. Understand Washington is more than just the first president. He creates the infrastructure and also the word of the day, the precedents. Okay? Understand political divisions. Our founding fathers thought that the Constitution and that the way they created the system would dissolve parties. Were they right? Whiskey Rebellion. War equals tax, tax equals conflict. We'll talk about it. So, take a look at this. New York City is the capital. Okay, Washington's inaugurated in 1789. He sets the precedent. We'll talk about that. What does he do? The precedent. Here's your cabinet. Okay, you got Alexander Hamilton. Yes, we'll play the music later. He's got to be in charge of the Treasury. He's going to be in charge of the money. The State Department, Foreign Relations. That's going to be Thomas Jefferson and then Henry Knox. War Department. Okay. This is the precedent. Do we have these cabinet members today? Yes, we do. Okay? Okay, you got to pay for the war. Congratulations. You won the war. You owe $52 million. Okay? The government has less than $3,000. So, who's going to fix this mess? Alexander Hamilton. All right. He has to pay off the debt. Here's the thing. Is there were these speculators that bought the bonds. And so if you pay these bonds back, it's not even going to the soldiers that were originally supposed to get the money. Hamilton says, I don't care. We're paying back the bonds because it creates good credit, okay? We want to establish the fact that if you borrow from the USA or whatever, we borrow from you, we pay you back, okay? So he's going to create a national bank. Is the word bank in the Constitution? Does he have the power to create the bank? Answer, maybe. Okay? So they're going to say necessary and proper. Article 1, Section 8 says necessary and proper clause. And he says we're going to pay all these bills and we're going to put a tax on imports. That's called a tariff. Real quick, what's a tariff? 1, 2, 3, tax on imports. Do you need to know tariff? Yes, you do. It's not just about this class. Do we have tariffs today? All the time. Go Google it. President Trump put a tariff on steel and aluminum coming from China. There's a tariff, I don't know if it got passed, but it was about wood coming from Canada or something like that. We put tariffs all the time. There's different kinds of tariffs, protectionist tariffs, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about it. Just know that a tariff is tax on imports. You need to know that. Because if they say they're going to put a tariff on a video game, do you say that's good or bad? Well, In one way, it's bad because video games will cost more if they're coming from foreign countries. In another way, it's good. It protects the video game industry here in America. It's up to you. Let's go. By the way, video game, terrible example because they're a worldwide creation anyway. Let's go. Okay, some states have paid off the debt already. Okay, so what's the problem? Hamilton's plan is for all the states to pay off the debt, but some states have already paid off the debt. So let's do this. You and your 5 friends, you as a group owe $5, and you've paid off your share. You've paid off your $1. And now they come along and they say, hey man, we need everybody to chip in for these $5. You're like, hey, I already paid it off. Okay, do you see how the states will be like, whoa, wait a second. That ain't cool. So they're like, all right, let's make a deal. I'll pay off the debt again, pay a little extra, but guess where the new capital is going to be? Down here in Virginia, okay? So, which becomes Washington, D.C., okay? Here's the Whiskey Rebellion. It's easier to move whiskey than it is to move grains because grains can rot, grains take up more room. So it's just, in order to move your grain, to put it on a ship or to move it to New York or whatever, it's just easier to turn it into whiskey. They put a tax on whiskey. Well, they burned down the tax collector's house. There's like a little mini riot going on. What does Washington do? He comes in, he leads the army. He comes in, he has them dead to rights. And what does he do? He captures them and he says, don't do it again. And he pardons them. This sets the precedent that we're strong enough to have law and order. But we're not trying, dude, can we all get along, man? We're not trying to go hang you and punish you. We just want to work together on this. He sets the precedent that we're a strong country. We have the ability to create law and order. But dude, let's go, man. We're all Americans. Let's go. Watch this quick video.
But Washington also had trouble on the domestic front, which threatened to tear apart the country's young democracy. In the summer of 1794, an armed insurrection of farmers and frontiersmen challenged the authority of federal tax collectors over a whiskey tax.
People in western Pennsylvania, they have a gun battle with the local revenue collector. The commander of the local militia is killed. A couple other people are killed and injured. And then the whole countryside is like enraged.
The whiskey rebels, they remembered that the Revolutionary War had been all about excessive taxation. There's a direct line that runs from the rebels of 1776 and the whiskey rebels of the 1790s.
Washington understood the threat this defiance posed to the country, but it also handed him an opportunity to cement the federal government's authority by putting the powers of the president into practice.
Washington marched troops into western Pennsylvania to suppress this revolt. The idea that the government was willing to do that and did that kind of action was really a strong statement.
The rebellion was put down without a shot ever being fired. After getting word that an army was marching out to meet them and that Washington was leading it, the rebels retreated to their homes.
Political force, but also very savvy. We have Art of America now. You didn't have Art of America before this because you had Art of England. We were part of England. Now we have American culture. We have these two political parties, and one believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and one believes in a more fluid. And one believes in a more loose interpretation of the Constitution. Today we call this original intent versus living document. And should we read the Constitution like the Founding Fathers thought, like exactly what they would have thought, or do we want to apply it to today? So what does freedom of speech mean? Well, back then it meant speech, maybe newspapers. Does freedom of speech apply to Facebook? Maybe, maybe not. Does Twitter have the right to ban you? Maybe, maybe not. How do you interpret the Constitution? Does that make sense? Okay, these are important issues.
Given that, is the Constitution a living document, open to interpretation, or is it something that must be read strictly and adhered to regardless of the day?
You know, Scott, that is the question that is asked constantly of judges. There are some things in the Constitution that are black and white. You can't, except during times of war, the government can't quarter troops in people's homes. Now, even in that black and white situation, what is the meaning of quartering troops? If there is some sort of war effort going on in the United States, and the government knocks on your door and says, our guys have to go in there for an hour and reprovision themselves or use your bathrooms or do something like that, the courts may be asked, is that quartering troops? Is that a constitutional violation? There's always that sort of twist in what happens. And then there are provisions that are very general in the Constitution. You can't have an unreasonable search and seizure. What does unreasonable mean? What's a search and seizure? On those three words, search, seizure, and unreasonable, law books are filled. Shelves and shelves of them are filled. And so to talk about strict interpretation or living constitution, those are not words I use. And they're not words that I think have much meaning, because what you are doing is interpreting new facts to an established law that in part has been given meaning and precedent, and that in part has a historical background. And you're drawing from all of that toolbox of precedents, history. Some of my colleagues don't rely on history, but others do. And from statutory construction principles. It is not about reading words strictly or about living constitution. It's about giving meaning on the basis of facts that are presented to you.
Okay, so there's a quick video. How do you interpret the Constitution? It's a very difficult thing. If you saw on that last thing where we're talking about the two parties, okay? One party, which party? The Republican Party wants to have agricultural economy. And then the other party, the Federalists, they want to have a manufacturing economy. I want you to see there's just a little bit of a divide. It's very small, but we have rural and urban, agricultural, manufacturing, southern, north. We're still getting along, but that rift is going to grow over the next, about 100 years. And then eventually we'll get to the Civil War. We're not even there. I'm not saying this is the cause of the Civil War, but you have different people with different goals. I just want you to see that. Okay? Important. Adam Smith. Who is he? He writes a book called The Wealth of Nations. This book is the foundation for capitalism. Okay, what is the economic system you live in today? Capitalism. Who writes the book or is the founder of capitalism? Adam Smith. What's his book called? Wealth of Nations. Do you need to know this? Absolutely, okay? In capitalism, here's what's up. You're gonna trade your most valuable asset, which is time, for money. And you're gonna have to spend this money, and how does your money get value and stuff like that. This is all part of the economics that you live under. So you should start to understand some of the basics of it. In capitalism, trade equals wealth, okay? This is different than mercantilism, which is what used to be the founding economic principles. Now it's capitalism, okay?
Hello, my name is Alexander Hamilton. I am a federalist who believes in giving more power to the national government. I believe in a strong navy to protect American merchant ships, and I favor building a strong trade relationship with Britain.
Hello Alexander, my name is Thomas Jefferson. I am a Democratic Republican. I believe in protecting individual and states' rights by reducing the size of federal power. I think America should have better commercial trade with France, and a great start would be to help them in their revolution.
I could not disagree more, Thomas. Getting involved in the French Revolution could be too costly as well as dangerous for our fragile new nation. We need to focus on ourselves. President Washington is right. Neutrality is the only foreign policy for our nation. Trade with everyone but make no permanent alliances. We need to focus more on our economy.
Don't you feel bad for the French? They are going through the same thing as we went through when we were controlled by a tyrannical king. They have no rights, and after all, they helped us. We owe them.
So we have different goals, okay? The Republicans, they're going to favor France. And the Federalists, they're going to favor England, okay? There's an election, Adams versus Jefferson. Adams gets the most votes, but Jefferson gets the second most votes. He becomes the vice president. It's different than what we do today, all right? So that's kind of interesting about how the system changes. Okay, we're going to talk about the Northwest Territory. It's 10 years after the treaty. What treaty does England sign that says we are our own country? Treaty of Paris. Very good. So the British won't leave, man. They don't understand. The party is over. You need to go home. So they're supplying the Native Americans with guns. The Americans are trying to buy land. And this is going to culminate in some of the wars that we're going to call these the Indian Wars. And you have Little Turtle, and they're going to beat the army. They're going to kill 900 people. But what happens is the American army can just, like, the more you lose, the more you can get. Like, there's an endless supply chain of soldiers coming out of the East. As opposed to the Native Americans, they can't replace their soldiers. So even though they win the battle, they lose the war. Does that make sense? Okay? And you'll see that. That was almost kind of like that in the Revolution. You'll see that in the Civil War as well. The Treaty of Greenville, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Here's a quick video on that.
Ohio's first inhabitants can be traced back to 9500 to 8000 BC. These first peoples were relatively simple and were offshoots of a much larger cultural group that swept into the Americas. Hunter-gatherers is the term most commonly used to describe them. Based off a rugged, nomadic lifestyle, these earliest peoples moved across the land hunting game and foraging for food as a means of survival. When North America began to warm up, the environment also changed. And with this change, the people living in Ohio began to adapt. The northern boreal forest, things like pines, spruces, and firs, that covered much of the land when the first people begun to arrive in Ohio, was being replaced by the eastern deciduous forest we're most familiar with today. Things like maple, hickory, oaks, and elms. With this new landscape brought new species of prey and more readily available sources of food. In this new landscape, the peoples of the Americas began to settle down and form villages. Out of these villages, along the northeastern Americas, came the cultures that would be dubbed woodland Indians. Tribes of these woodland cultures also inhabited Ohio. Examples of such tribes are the Chippewa, Delaware, Iroquois, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Shawnee. With European settlement of Ohio in the late 17 to early 1800s, conflict between the Native Americans and the Europeans steadily increased. Around 1790, the United States Congress sent the first of 3 expeditions out to subdue the Native Americans in the Ohio area, as well as provide safety to the settlers. In command was General Joshua Harmer. After suffering a large defeat, General Harmer withdrew back to Fort Washington later that year. In September 1791, Major General St. Clair led another force to accomplish this same goal. His idea was to establish forts northward from Fort Washington, which is present-day Cincinnati, to the inlet of the Maumee River, which is present-day Toledo. It was thought that this would help establish the United States' control over the territory and also provide safety to newly arriving settlers. On the banks of the Wabash River, Major General St. Clair was soundly defeated by a Native American force led by the war chief Little Turtle. This defeat would later be referred to as the worst defeat suffered by the United States. Understanding that the United States could not endure another defeat like Major General St. Clair's, George Washington placed General Anthony Wayne in charge. General Wayne would march out of Fort Washington with around 3,000 highly trained and very well-disciplined troops. One of the first of many changes made by General Wayne was to the actual formation and command structure of his army. Wayne organized his army into a legion in the same style of the early Roman civilization. From there, the army was then divided into 4 separate sub-legions. Each contained its own infantry, artillery, and dragoons. These sub-legions were then trained extensively together to work as a single unit. They were trained and could be used as an individual fighting force, or join the other sub-legions to become a larger force. This provided not only a unified fighting group, but one able to support itself. Although this design was thousands of years old, it was an entirely new concept in the United States military. General Wayne's attention for detail led him to represent each sub-legion by their own color trim on their uniform and by a sub-legion specific flag in that group's color. Furthermore, many people inside the sub-legions were cross-trained to do other people's jobs so they could fill in for them. With his Grand Legion, General Wayne set out from Fort Washington with the same plan as Major General St. Clair, establishing forts about every 20 miles heading north to the inlet of the Maumee Bay area. At the site of Major General St. Clair's defeat, he built Fort Recovery. Leaving a detachment of 200 soldiers, he continued on north to confront the Native Americans in the area. On June 30th of 1794, a combined confederation of 2,000-plus Native American warriors led by the great Miami war chief Little Turtle descended on the fort in hope of handing the United States yet another crushing defeat. In the early morning hours on that hot day in June, the battle commenced with the surrounding and utter defeat of 200 sharpshooters who were camped within a mile of the fort. Of the 200 sharpshooters, only 50 made it back to Fort Recovery. Yet these 50 men were a much-needed bolster to the 200 men who were already stationed inside the walls. For 2 days, the battle raged on the banks of the Wabash River. In the end, the Native Americans called off the assault and retreated. The 250 defenders successfully fought for their peace to the United States against an army of over 2,000 Native Americans. With this defeat, Little Turtle was said to realize that a continued conflict with the United States of America would be the end of the Miami. After the unsuccessful attack on Fort Recovery led by Little Turtle, General Wayne caught up with the remnants of the army at a storm-ravaged field inside the present-day city of Toledo. There, Little Turtle and General Wayne's armies clashed. The Native Americans took up a defensive position along the Maumee River and waited for General Wayne's advancing army. A brief account of the battle, written by G. Michael Pratt, doctor at Heidelberg College in Tiffin, Ohio, as follows. On the morning of August 20th, 1794, the Legion of the United States marched downstream from its encampment in 5 parallel columns. A screen of 150 mounted Kentucky volunteers marched some 400 yards in front of these and formed the front guard. After riding about 5 miles, the mounted volunteers stumbled into the center of the Native American line, which had up to 1,000 warriors of Confederacy of Great Lakes Indian tribes. In the face of this ambush, the Kentuckians fled and exposed the Federal front guard, who attempted to retreat while returning fire, but eventually also fled the field. The momentum of the Indian attack was stemmed in front of a hastily formed light infantry skirmish line. The warriors then sought shelter in an area of tomato-filled timber and opened a sustained firefight along the skirmish line. The legionnaires were slowly forced back some 80 yards as groups of warriors pressed forward and sought to flank their line. During this skirmish, the remainder of the legion deployed from its columns into the line of battle. During this maneuver, the skirmish line was reinforced with riflemen and light infantry, while artillery companies from the center column. The artillery opened fire with shot and shell and switched to canister as the warriors pressed within about 80 yards of their position. As the firefight spread along the length of the U.S. line, the dragoons were ordered to ride to the river and flank the Indian line. The cavalry charge quickly faltered when the troopers encountered heavy fire from concealed warriors and their commander fell. On the left side of the line, the reserve was ordered forward to extend the battle line to protect the left flank. But before this move could be completed, the entire legion was ordered to charge, which carried the army 1 to 2 miles downstream, halting only when Indian resistance dissipated and the legion's formation became disorganized. The legion was brought to a halt, reformed, and remained in a defensive posture for several hours. No Indian counterattack developed, and after a selection of a campsite, the army moved to the high ground overlooking the foot of the rapids and within sight of Fort Miami and its garrison. On August 3rd of 1795, the great war chief Little Turtle, as well as many of the other chiefs of the Ohio Valley, gathered together to present General Anthony Wayne with a wampum belt, as well as sign the Treaty of Greenville, which would effectively end hostilities in the Ohio Valley. In short, the Treaty of Greenville was a treaty of peace between the United States of America and the tribes of Indians called Wyandots, Delawares, Shawanoes, Chippewas, Potawatomis, Miamis, Eel River, Weas, Kickapoos, Pinkashaws, and Kinkashaw. The Treaty of Greenville was also the first time that the United States had a set boundary between white settlement and Indian territories. The Treaty of Greenville is seen as the groundwork or foundation from which America's expansion into the Northwest.
Okay, in France, they're going to have a revolution. Who would we support? The revolutionaries, because we were revolutionaries ourselves. But it starts to get a little crazy. They call it the Reign of Terror. They get out the guillotine. There's not much justice. Somebody just points their hand, hey, I heard this guy. Oh, off with his head, okay? It's pretty crazy, so it becomes more difficult to support, if that makes sense. Britain and France are at war. Washington does not want to take sides. He doesn't feel that it's in our interest on either way. He says, you know what's in our interest? To trade with both countries and make money, all right? And so John Jay secures this treaty, the John Jay Treaty, and it's basically going to England and saying, quit harassing our ships, quit capturing our ships. It's no big deal. But France sees that as sort of a poke in the eye, like, oh, we made some treaty with England and we're really their friends or something like that. Okay, I'll try to attach this to the video, the primary source of the day. It's Washington's farewell address, so please read that. But in it, he advocates what? Avoid foreign entanglements, okay? This will be quoted even till today. We get ready to go to a war somewhere, you'll hear a politician, oh, you know what I think we should do? Avoid foreign entanglements. We should listen to George Washington. Avoid foreign entanglements. That is his final piece of advice before he rides off into the sunset. That is his farewell address. So after he's done, by the way, Washington serves 2 terms. He sets the precedent. That's not in the Constitution at this time, that you can only be president for 8 years. He does 2 terms, he does 8 years, and then he's out, okay? Every president will do the same thing up until FDR, and then it becomes an amendment. But at this time, there was no amendment requiring that. When he leaves behind a country with a functioning government, an improving economy, and he kept us out of the war in Europe, okay? So that is the legacy of George Washington. In addition to being a general and a founding father, he helps establish this country. And then there was this war, or not this war, this rebellion. He rides in, he captures them all, but then he pardons them. Do you remember what that was called? Whiskey Rebellion, okay? And if you remember the name, great. But more importantly, it establishes that the country's strong enough to establish law and order, but we're not trying to be crazy, okay? Not trying to be too strict. Laws that are too strict from sixth grade, does anybody remember? Draconian, okay? Draconian laws, too strict. All right, John Adams becomes the second president. Why are they upset? He is staying neutral. France helped us. We're not helping France. They don't like that. Well, that's life. So there's this thing called the XYZ affair. Adams sends some diplomats to France to try to calm things down. They ask for a bribe. And France says, hey, give us some money. And the delegates say, not a sixpence, okay? We'd rather pay $1 million for war than give you 6 cents as a bribe. That's pretty much what they say. Here's a fun cartoon about the XYZ affair.
Angry at U.S. neutrality in the British-French conflict, the French had attacked a number of American ships. It was a big problem for President John Adams. The French keep attacking American ships. What shall I do? I must send smart diplomats to negotiate with French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Perigord. We are 3 smart diplomats. We want to negotiate. Please send us to France. My dream has come true. Surely Charles Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry will successfully negotiate. Well, what are you waiting for? Get to work. Consider it done, Mr. President. This is cool. Dude, we're like diplomats. Here come the foreign minister's representatives. Let us report to them as X, Y, and Z. So you want us to leave your ships alone? Ah, yes we do. How much? I'd say pretty much. Enough to offer us a ride. Get lost, pal. France is a powerful country. You better pay. We'd rather fight an expensive war than pay you some stupid crime. We say millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. You'll be sorry.
When Americans got word of how disrespectfully they'd been treated by the French, many wanted to go to war. George Washington was ready to come out of retirement to lead the army. Adams, however, tried further negotiation, and this time, France treated America seriously. The XYZ affair, so named because that's how Americans referred to the French representatives who demanded a bribe, showed the world that the United States demanded to be treated with respect.
All right, welcome back. Now we're talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts. All right. Okay, we're scared about those immigrants from France, okay? So it increases from 5 to 14 years. If you want to become a citizen, it used to take you 5 years, now it takes you 14 years, okay? President can just kick you out if they think you're a dangerous alien. They also passed this law, a Sedition Act. It's a crime to insult the government. Are you allowed to insult the government? Well, yeah, okay, you have the freedom of speech, okay? So that's not going to stand in court, and we'll get into that later, okay? Here we go. Virginia and Kentucky create a resolution that says they can nullify a federal law. To be continued. We talked in class about federalism. You have states, you have the national government, and they share power. But what happens, who's got the final say? Okay, these powers go back and forth, but at some point, someone has to have the final word, the final say. In this instance, Virginia and Kentucky are saying the states have the final say. Is that true? Answer, we don't know at this point. This will be one of the causes of the Civil War, or one of the factors determining, going into the Civil War. Do states have the final say, or does the national government have the final say? Anyway, I just want you to see that problem, it's not bubbling, but maybe there's a little tiny bubble. It's not boiling, but it's hot. We'll see what happens with that down the line. All right, Hamilton's job to fix this mess. Okay, you got to pay off the debt. They moved the capital. Okay, Hamilton's job to pay off this mess. What is he going to do? Do you remember this? Okay, we're going to pay back all of our debt. We're going to create a national bank. Is that allowed? Maybe, maybe not. We'll find out later. So that's it for Chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you take the quiz on the next class session, and we'll see you back here next week.